The rain came down in sheets, each drop hitting the muddy street like a tiny hammer blow. It was the kind of rain that washes things away, or makes the mud so deep you can never get out. On the steps of the Redemption Falls Church, a man stood like a statue carved from vengeance. His name was Matthew Shepard, and the water pouring off his hat didn't bother him one bit. His eyes, hard as Montana granite, were locked on two men cowering under the church awning. They were cousins, Thomas and Jeremiah Blackwood, and right now they looked more like cornered rats than members of the town's most powerful family. The steel of Matt's Colt revolver was a dull, deadly gray in the dim light. It didn't waver, not even a fraction of an inch. "If you touch her again," Matt's voice sliced through the downpour, low and clear and colder than a grave, "you will die." He let the words hang in the air, letting them sink in. This wasn't some drunken boast from a saloon. This was a sermon delivered from the barrel of a gun. "That's not a threat," he said, his gaze unflinching. "It's a promise. Before God." Behind him, clinging to a hitching post, was the reason for it all. Sarah Carson. Her dress was stretched tight over a belly that was 8 months full, and her eyes were wide with a terror that was slowly turning into a kind of awe. She'd known cruelty. She'd known heartbreak. But she had never seen a man stand so perfectly still while making death itself seem to bloom in the air around him. Thomas Blackwood, the bigger of the two, tried to muster some of his family's famous arrogance. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the mud at his feet. "You ain't got no right." "I've got every right," Matt cut him off, the words like chipping ice. There wasn't a tremor in his voice, not a hint of doubt. "Every right that God gives a man to protect the innocent." Jeremiah, younger and dumber, let his hand drift toward his own pistol. It was a foolish, reflexive move, the kind that gets men killed. Matt didn't move. He didn't even seem to blink. His voice dropped even lower, becoming a lethal whisper that the wind carried straight to Jeremiah's ears. "Your hand touches that gun, son. It'll be the last thing you ever do." There was something in that voice, a certainty as old and immovable as the mountains that ring the valley. Jeremiah's fingers froze, hovering just inches from the worn leather of his holster. The world seemed to stop. The rain, the wind, the very heartbeats of the men standing in the mud. Everything held its breath. Then the church door creaked open. Muted light spilled out, framing a figure in the doorway. "What in God's name is happening on my doorstep?" The voice belonged to Pastor Chester, his white clerical collar a stark slash of piety against his black coat. He looked from the Blackwood boys to the stranger with the gun, his face a mask of confusion and disapproval. Matt didn't lower his Colt. He just nodded his head toward the cousins. "Ask them," he said, his voice flat. "Ask them what they were about to do to a woman carrying a child." The pastor's eyes flickered to Sarah, taking in her swollen belly and her terrified expression. Then he looked back at the Blackwoods, and whatever he saw in their faces, guilt, fear, a cornered animal's meanness, made his mouth tighten into a thin, unhappy line. He knew. Of course he knew. In a town this small, everyone knew everything. They just chose what to see. 3 months, Matt said, and the words were like stones dropped into a deep, still pond. That's how long I've waited for justice. That's how long I've watched. He took one slow step forward, the mud sucking at his boots. His eyes never left the Blackwood boys, but his next words were for everyone. For the pastor, for the town, for the gray and weeping sky. And I'm done waiting. 3 months earlier, the first thing Sarah Carson tasted was dirt. It gritted against her teeth as her cheeks scraped against the rough wood of the Blackwood porch. Dust and the coppery tang of blood filled her mouth. A boot connected with her back, not hard enough to break a rib, just hard enough to send a clear message. You are not welcome here. You are less than the dirt on our boots. You got no business coming here. Agatha Blackwood's voice was as cold and sharp as a shard of winter ice. You made your bed when you opened your legs for my son. Now lie in it, somewhere else. Sarah pushed herself up, her movements slow and deliberate. One hand went instinctively to her belly. 5 months along and showing enough that loose dresses couldn't hide the truth anymore. Not that hiding had ever been an option. In Redemption Falls, a town of 800 souls, Secrets had a shorter lifespan than mayflies. Mrs. Blackwood, she managed, her voice steadier than her trembling legs. I'm not asking for myself. It's for your son's child, your grandchild. My son, Agatha said, her face a granite mask of denial, is betrothed to Margaret Wilcox. He is going to be a judge. He is going to make something of himself untainted by your mistake. Every word was a slap. Behind the old woman, a shadow moved in the grand doorway. It was Victor, tall, handsome, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed of money and importance. His eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at her with what she'd mistaken for love, met hers for a single, fleeting second. There was nothing in them. No recognition, no shame, no regret. Just a cold, blank emptiness. He turned without a word and walked back into the warmth and safety of his father's house, leaving her on the porch in the dirt. If I see you on this property again, Agatha whispered, leaning in so only Sarah could hear the venom in her voice, I will have Sheriff Wallace run you out of town as a vagrant and a whore. Is that clear? Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded once, her throat tight with unshed tears. She picked up the shawl she had dropped and turned away, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She would not stumble. She walked away from the grandest house in town and made her way to the humblest, a small, forgotten shed behind what had once been her father's carpentry shop. Since his death in the war, the shop had fallen into ruin, but the shed was still sound. It was where she lived now. Agatha Blackwood had made sure of that, convincing Sarah's landlady that renting to a woman of loose morals would bring God's judgment down on her boarding house. The shed wasn't much. A dirt floor, a small iron stove that smoked more than it heated, and a narrow cot. But it was hers, and in the corner, covered by an old quilt, was her one remaining treasure, a small, upright piano. Her father, a master carpenter, had built it for her with his own hands for her 16th birthday. It was too heavy to move, too precious to sell. She sank onto the cot, her hand never leaving her belly. It's just you and me now, little one, she whispered to the life inside her. But we'll be all right. We have to be. Outside, the first leaves of fall were starting to turn, painting the valley in shades of gold and fire. And from the shadows of the general store across the street, a man watched her go. He was a stranger to Redemption Falls, a man with quiet eyes and a stillness about him that was more dangerous than any loud threat. He watched Sarah Carson disappear into the dilapidated shed, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. He had seen this story before, and he knew how it ended. But this time, he thought, the ending was going to be different. Sunday morning came, painting the single dusty window of the shed with delicate patterns of frost. Sarah woke to the distant toll of the church bell, a sound that felt like a phantom limb, a part of her she could still feel, but that had been cut away. A year ago, she would have been there, her fingers warming up on the piano keys, ready to lead the congregation in song. Now she was the sinner they whispered about in their prayers. She rose, her back aching, and looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. A stranger looked back. Thinner, with dark shadows under her eyes, but with the undeniable fullness of pregnancy in her face. She dressed in her only clean dress, a faded blue cotton, and pinned up her long brown hair. She didn't plan on going inside the church. She couldn't bear the stares, the judgment, but she needed to be near it. She needed to hear the music. The town was quiet as she walked, a ghost moving through her own life. She stopped at the base of the church steps, close enough to hear the faint strains of Just As I Am drifting through the wooden walls. She closed her eyes, her hand on her belly, and felt a tiny flutter of movement. One day, she whispered to her unborn child, you'll sing in there, and you will hold your head high. The church door opened suddenly, and Pastor Chester stood framed in the doorway. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something. Pity, maybe? Then it was gone, replaced by a mask of stern discomfort. Without a word, he turned and closed the door, shutting her out. The message was as clear as if he'd shouted it. You are not welcome here. As she turned to walk away, her throat tight, she hummed the melody of the hymn under her breath. It was a small act of defiance, a claim on the faith that had been stolen from her. She didn't see the man watching from the deep shadows of the livery stable. He had been there all morning. He had seen her walk to the church. He had seen the pastor close the door in her face. And in his quiet, watchful eyes, a cold, hard decision was taking shape. The Broken Spur Saloon was where Hope went to die. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and regret. At a corner table, his back to the wall, sat Matthew Shepard. He had been in Redemption Falls for 3 days and had spoken maybe a dozen words. He drank little, gambled none, and his gaze missed nothing. His attention was fixed on 2 men at the bar, Thomas and Jeremiah Blackwood. They were drinking hard, their voices getting louder with every glass. "Saw that Carson girl again," Thomas slurred, loud enough for half the saloon to hear. "Waddling around the church like she belongs there." Jeremiah snickered. "Victor sure messed that one up. Should have picked a girl who knew how to take care of an accident." They both laughed, a ugly, braying sound. "Maybe we ought to remind her she ain't welcome," Thomas said, draining his glass. "Teach her to stay in her place." "What place is that?" Jeremiah goaded. "Behind the stables?" The laughter was fouler this time. Matt's fingers tightened around his whiskey glass, the knuckles turning white. He watched as the cousins tossed a few coins on the bar and stumbled out into the afternoon sun, their intentions clear and vile. Matt didn't rush. He calmly placed a coin next to his untouched drink, rose from his chair, and followed them out. The time for watching was over. The sun was low in the sky when Sarah made her way back to the shed. She'd spent the afternoon gathering wild berries in the woods, a small, sweet luxury. She was so focused on the basket on her arm, she didn't see the Blackwood cousins until they stepped directly in her path, blocking her way. "Well, look who it is," Thomas drawled, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Victor's little mistake, out for a stroll." Sarah tried to step around them. "Please, let me pass." Jeremiah moved to block her again. He reached out and patted her pregnant belly, his touch lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Practically family, ain't we?" She recoiled, stumbling back. "Don't touch me." "Ooh, she's got fire," Thomas laughed. "You weren't so picky a few months back, were you?" People were starting to notice. A few townsfolk stopped, watching from a safe distance, their faces carefully blank. No one moved to help. No one ever did when the Blackwoods were involved. "I just want to go home," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. "Home?" Thomas sneered. "You mean that pigsty of a shed? That ain't a home." Jeremiah grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard. "Maybe you need a reminder of what happens to girls who get above their station." The basket fell from her grasp, spilling the precious berries into the dirt like drops of blood. She cried out, more in fear than in pain. "Let her go." The voice came from behind them. It wasn't loud, but it was edged with something that cut through the air like a razor. Thomas and Jeremiah turned. Matt stood a few paces away, his posture relaxed, his hands empty at his sides. But his eyes were not relaxed. They were the eyes of a wolf. Jeremiah snorted. "Mind your own business, stranger." "I'm making it my business," Matt said, taking a single, unhurried step forward. Thomas's hand drifted towards his gun. "You have any idea who you're talking to?" "2 men," Matt said, his gaze flicking to the hand still clamped on Sarah's arm. "About to make a very big mistake. Let her go. Now." "Or what?" Jeremiah challenged, though a flicker of doubt had entered his eyes. Matt didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He simply looked Jeremiah Blackwood in the eye and said the words that would change everything in Redemption Falls. "If you touch her again," he said, and it was a statement of absolute fact, like the sun rising or the river flowing, "you will die." In the stunned silence that followed, Jeremiah's fingers loosened as if they'd been burned. Sarah pulled her arm free, scrambling back from them. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath. Then Thomas, trying to save face, forced a laugh. "Come on, Jer, she ain't worth the trouble." He shot a poisonous look at Sarah. "We'll finish this later, sweetheart." They backed away, trying to look tough, and retreated toward the saloon. Sarah stood trembling, one hand rubbing the bruised flesh of her arm. She looked up at the stranger who had just saved her. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded, then knelt to pick up her fallen basket, gathering the few berries that hadn't been crushed into the dirt. He handed it back to her. You shouldn't be alone, he said, his voice softer now. They'll be back. I don't have a choice, Sarah replied, a trace of bitterness in her voice. No one in town will rent to me. Matt studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he seemed to come to a decision. There's a boarding house at the edge of town. Ruth Miller's place. Sarah shook her head. Mrs. Miller wouldn't. She will, Matt interrupted, with that same unshakable certainty. He turned and started walking. Come with me. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew she would follow. And for the first time in months, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in Sarah Carson's heart. Ruth Miller's boarding house was different. It stood on the edge of town, its windows facing the mountains, not the dusty main street. Ruth herself was a woman carved from hardship. A widow who'd come west after losing her husband at Gettysburg. She had the stern eyes of a battlefield nurse and hands that knew how to both heal and hurt. She opened the door before Matt even knocked. Matthew Shepard, she said, her voice betraying no surprise. I wondered when you'd show your face. If Matt was shocked that she knew his name, he didn't let it show. Mrs. Miller, I need a room for Miss Carson. Ruth's sharp eyes took in Sarah's condition in a single glance. The faded dress, the bruises on her arm, the exhaustion in her posture. Victor Blackwood's leavings, I presume. Sarah flushed, looking at the floor. The Blackwoods have made it clear she's not welcome in town, Matt said. I'll pay double. Ruth waved a dismissive hand. I don't need your money, Mr. Shepard, and I've never given a damn what the Blackwoods think. She stepped aside, holding the door open. Come in, Miss Carson. You look like you could use a hot meal and a real bed. The inside was clean, warm, and smelled of baking bread. It was the safest Sarah had felt in months. I can't pay much, she said hesitantly. We'll sort that later, Ruth said briskly. She showed Sarah to a small, spotless room on the second floor. My house has rules, she said, her tone softening slightly. No drunkenness, no loud noises. But your condition doesn't bother me, girl. What bothers me is seeing a good man's daughter treated like trash. Sarah blinked back tears. Why are you helping me? I knew your father, Jacob, Ruth said, a flicker of old sadness in her eyes. He was a good man, an honest craftsman. And besides, she added, her expression hardening, I've seen enough of what bullies can do to last a lifetime. No need to let them win when a simple kindness is all it takes to stop them. She left Sarah to settle in. Downstairs, Matt stood by the window, watching the street. All right, preacher, Ruth said quietly, coming to stand beside him. You want to tell me why you're really here? Matt's jaw tightened at the title. I'm not a preacher anymore. The cloth might be gone, but the calling never leaves, Ruth said. It's been what? 3 years since the fire? A shadow passed over Matt's face, a glimpse of a wound that would never heal. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. And you've been hunting Blackwood's men ever since, Ruth stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Matt finally turned to face her. How do you know? News travels, even to a backwater like this. A preacher loses his wife and child in a fire set by his enemies. A man leaves a trail of bodies across 3 territories, all of them connected to one name, Blackwood. She shook her head. The question isn't how I know, Matthew. It's what you plan to do now that you're here. Richard Blackwood cheated the hangman, Matt said, a cold satisfaction in his voice. Died of pneumonia last winter, but his legacy is still here. His son, his nephews, his whole rotten tree. It needs pruning, right down to the roots. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, Ruth quoted softly. A grim, broken smile touched Matt's lips. Then he's taking too damn long. That night, after a quiet supper, Sarah found Matt on the back porch, staring out into the darkness. I don't know how to thank you, she said. No need, he replied, his gaze still fixed on the shadows. I have to ask, she said, her voice barely a whisper. What you said to them, to the Blackwood boys. Did you mean it? He finally turned to look at her, and in the faint lantern light, she could see the profound, bottomless grief in his eyes. It was a grief that mirrored her own. I don't say things I don't mean, Miss Carson, he said, and Sarah believed him. She just didn't understand what had happened to a man to make him able to speak of death with such calm, chilling certainty. She was about to find out. Later that night, long after the town had gone to sleep, Matt found himself drawn to the one place he had avoided for over 3 years, the church. The door was unlocked. He slipped inside, a ghost in God's house. The air was cold and smelled of old wood and beeswax. I know you're listening, he whispered into the cavernous silence. You always are. He stood in the darkness, the weight of his lost faith pressing down on him. I told them you heard every prayer, that you had a plan. His voice broke, thick with unshed tears. I don't believe that anymore, but I believe you're there, and I want it on the record. I'm going to finish this, all of them, every last person who had a hand in it. He clenched his fists. And if that costs me my soul, so be it. It's a price I'm willing to pay. The only answer was silence. As he turned to leave, he heard a soft click from a side office. The pastor's study. Matt melted back into the shadows as Pastor Chester emerged carrying a ledger book. He looked furtive, nervous. He quickly crossed to the altar, knelt for a moment in a mockery of prayer, and then slipped out a back door. Matt frowned. What business did a pastor have sneaking around his own church in the dead of night? What was in that ledger? It was another piece of the puzzle, another thread in the web of corruption that seemed to cover Redemption Falls. And Matt intended to pull on every single thread until the whole thing unraveled. The next morning, Sarah woke to the unfamiliar comfort of a real bed. Downstairs, Ruth was in the kitchen. There's an old piano in the sitting room, the older woman said gruffly. Hasn't been played in years. You're welcome to it. The offer was like a gift of water in a desert. Sarah went to the sitting room and sat at the old upright. Her fingers, hesitant at first, found a familiar melody. It wasn't a hymn, but an old folk tune her father had taught her. The music filled the house, a song of sorrow and resilience, of love lost and hope not yet extinguished. She closed her eyes, letting the music carry her away. She didn't see Matt pause outside the window, listening. The sound seemed to break through the hard shell he had built around himself, touching something deep inside. For a moment, he wasn't the vengeful hunter. He was just a man, remembering a different woman who used to play the piano, in a different house, in a life that had been turned to ash. His reverie was broken by the sight of Sheriff Heron Wallace heading his way. Matt stepped out to meet him. Shepard, the sheriff said, his eyes shrewd. Been asking about you. Sent a wire to the marshal's office. Funny thing, they have a list of registered bounty hunters. Your name's not on it. Matt's expression didn't change. Must be an oversight. I don't think so, Wallace said, his hand casually drifting toward the butt of his pistol. I think you're lying about who you are, and men who lie usually have something to hide. The air crackled with tension. Before it could snap, Ruth Miller appeared, carrying a basket. Sheriff Wallace, just the man I was looking for. Mr. Shepard was just about to help me carry some supplies. Wallace looked from Ruth to Matt, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he let his hand drop. We're not done here, Shepard, he said, his voice low. This is a peaceful town. I aim to keep it that way. As Matt walked away with Ruth, she glanced at him. Wallace isn't a fool. You need to be more careful. The Blackwoods have deep roots here, she warned. You try to cut down that tree, and you'll find the whole town rises up to defend it. Matt's smile was thin and cold. Then I'll just have to dig up the whole damn thing, roots and all. The rain started that afternoon. Matt found Sarah in the sitting room, the gray light from the window falling on her face. He asked her to play for him. She chose a gentle, hopeful piece by Bach. As the music filled the room, he stood by the window, his back to her, but she saw the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. When she finished, he turned, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the man he must have been before. The grief was still there, but it was joined by something else, a shared understanding. Why? She asked, her voice soft. Why are you doing all this for me? He looked at her swollen belly, at the quiet strength in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. And he told her. He told her about Pine Ridge, about his wife, Rebecca, and his 5-year-old son, James. He told her about the fire, a fire set by men working for Richard Blackwood, Victor's father. They were trying to silence me, he said, his voice a raw whisper of pain. I was preaching against Blackwood, against the way he crushed anyone who got in his way. They decided to make an example of me. He touched the faint, pale scar on his throat, a scar Sarah had never noticed before. They left me hanging from an oak tree behind the church, left me for dead. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp of horror. They took everything from me, Sarah, he said, his eyes meeting hers. Everything. When I saw what those boys were doing to you, it was like seeing it all happen again. I couldn't just stand by. Not this time. Now she understood. She understood the coldness in his voice, the certainty in his promise of death. It wasn't born of cruelty, but of a pain so profound it had burned away everything else, leaving only the need for justice. I am so sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face for him, for his lost family, for the terrible path he was now forced to walk. He just nodded, a man long past tears. Suddenly Ruth appeared in the doorway, her face grim. There's someone here to see you, Sarah, she said. It's Victor Blackwood. Victor stood in the sitting room, looking handsome and uncomfortable. Sarah, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. I heard you had some trouble with my cousins. I wanted to apologize and to make arrangements. Arrangements? Sarah's voice was ice. For the child, he said, barely glancing at her belly. I'm prepared to take financial responsibility. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Now? After months of leaving me to starve? After your mother had me thrown in the dirt? What changed, Victor? He shifted his weight. There's talk about a stranger in town, a dangerous man. His eyes met hers and she saw the truth. It wasn't concern, it was jealousy, possessiveness. Who is he to you, Sarah? He's a decent man, she shot back. Something you wouldn't understand. He'll be gone in a week, Victor sneered. Men like him always move on. I'm offering you and your problem security. My family's name still means something in this town. If you turn me down, don't expect any other doors to open for you. It was a threat, wrapped in a pretty bow. I don't want your money, Victor, Sarah said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. And I don't want your protection. We'll be fine without it. As Victor stormed out, Matt stepped into the room, his face dark. What did he say? He warned me you'd leave me, she said, looking him straight in the eye. Are you just passing through, Matt? Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside. Ruth rushed to the window. Riders, she said, her voice tight. 4 of them. It's the Blackwood cousins, and they've brought friends. Matt's hand went to his gun. Stay inside, he said, his voice calm and deadly. He walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch to face them alone. The simmering pot was about to boil over. Heard you've been making threats, stranger, Thomas Blackwood shouted from his saddle. Not threats, Matt called back, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Promises. One of the hired hands reached for his gun. At the same moment, the front door opened again. Ruth Miller stepped out, a double-barreled shotgun cradled in her arms. This is private property, she announced, her voice like cracking granite. Get off it, now! The men hesitated, caught between Matt's cold stare and Ruth's shotgun. For a long, tense moment, it seemed like the street would run with blood. But the Blackwood boys were bullies, not killers. Not yet. They snarled a few more threats and galloped away. The immediate danger was gone, but everyone on the porch knew it was just a temporary reprieve. They had poked the hornet's nest. Now the whole swarm would be coming for them. The attack came that night. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was something more cowardly, more insidious. Sarah was in her room when she heard the crash of glass from downstairs, followed by the terrifying smell of smoke. She rushed out to see Matt beating back flames that were licking up the sitting room curtains. Someone had thrown a firebomb through the window. They were trying to burn them out, just like they did in Pine Ridge. The fire was quickly extinguished, but the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. Just then, another figure appeared in the chaos. Abigail Porter, the quiet school teacher who also boarded at Ruth's. I have a place, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. A cabin in the mountains my father built. It's isolated. No one would think to look for you there. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Under the cover of darkness, they loaded Sarah's precious piano onto a borrowed wagon. Matt wasn't just saving Sarah anymore. He was saving the last piece of her past, the last gift from her father. They fled Redemption Falls, leaving the smoldering curtains and the town's hatred behind them, and disappeared into the vast, dark wilderness of the mountains. The cabin was a sanctuary, hidden deep in a stand of pines by a rushing creek. But Matt knew it was only a matter of time. The Blackwoods would be hunting them. He couldn't just wait for them to find him. He had to take the fight to them. But how? He was one man against a family that owned the town, including the sheriff. The answer came the next morning, riding up the hidden trail alone. It was Sheriff Wallace. "Shepard, I know you're in there," he called out. "I'm alone. We need to talk." Matt met him at the door, his gun ready. "How did you find us?" "I was a scout in the war," Wallace said, "and I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to help." He looked tired, his face etched with a conflict he'd been avoiding for too long. "The Blackwoods have gone too far. They assaulted Ruth Miller this morning, trying to find out where you'd gone. They burned down Sarah's old shed." He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I've been looking the other way for years, taking their money, keeping their peace. But this is different." He revealed a shocking connection. "I served with your brother Michael in the war," he said quietly. "He saved my life at Chattanooga. I owe him. I owe you." He offered them a way out. Passage on a riverboat leaving for St. Louis the next morning. New names, a new life. "Just go," the sheriff urged. "Leave this place to its demons. For her sake." He nodded towards Sarah, who had come to stand beside Matt. It was a tempting offer, a chance to escape, to start over, to raise her child in peace. Sarah looked at Matt, her eyes pleading. "Maybe we should take it," she whispered. "Let it be over." Matt was torn. To walk away felt like letting them win, like betraying the memory of his wife and son. But to stay meant putting Sarah and her unborn child directly in the path of a storm of violence. Before he could decide, the crack of a rifle echoed through the valley. They were not alone. "Ambush!" Wallace yelled, drawing his own gun as figures emerged from the trees. It was the Blackwoods. Thomas and Jeremiah and a half-dozen hired guns, their faces twisted with hate, and leading them was Victor. But he wasn't the one who had led them there. A final figure stepped out from behind a tree, his face pale with shame and fear. It was Pastor Chester. "They threatened to burn the church," he stammered, unable to meet their eyes. "I had no choice." "There's always a choice, preacher," Matt said, his voice laced with contempt, as he pushed Sarah behind him. The mountain clearing exploded into a nightmare of gunfire and shouting. Wallace went down, clutching a bloody shoulder. Matt, moving with a deadly grace, took down two of the hired guns. Sarah, seeing him pinned down, grabbed the rifle from the saddle and fired, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. Thomas Blackwood fell, a look of surprise on his face. In the chaos, Victor grabbed the pastor and started to retreat. "It's over, Shepard," he screamed. "You've lost." Matt didn't hesitate. He told Sarah to stay with the wounded sheriff and plunged into the forest after Victor. He tracked them to a narrow ledge overlooking a deep, dark ravine. "It ends here, Blackwood," Matt yelled. Victor, panicking, shoved Pastor Chester at Matt and tried to run. The ground, loosened by the recent rains, crumbled under his feet. He scrabbled for purchase, his feet slipping. And then he was falling. In a split second, instinct overrode years of hate. Matt lunged forward and grabbed Victor's wrist, his own boots sliding dangerously close to the abyss. For a heart-stopping moment, they hung there, the hunter and the hunted, suspended between life and death. "Why?" Victor gasped, his face a mask of disbelief. "Why save me?" Matt's muscles strained, the rock crumbling under his boots. "Because this isn't who I am anymore," he grunted, pulling with all his strength. He was losing his grip. Sarah screamed his name. Wallace, wounded but determined, crawled forward, grabbing Matt's belt to anchor him. They were going to make it. They were going to pull him up. Then another shot rang out from the trail above them. Victor's body jerked in Matt's grasp. A dark stain blossomed on his shirt. His eyes went wide with a final terrible surprise. His grip loosened. "Tell my mother," he whispered, his voice a bloody gurgle. "I'm sorry." And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the ravine. Matt and Wallace scrambled back from the edge, looking up the trail. Pastor Chester stood there, a smoking pistol in his trembling hand. "He was going to kill you," the preacher sobbed, the gun falling from his numb fingers. I couldn't let my cowardice kill anyone else." He sank to his knees, a broken man who had finally, in the worst possible way, found his courage. It was over. The shooting had stopped. The silence of the mountains descended, broken only by the pastor's quiet weeping. Sarah rushed to Matt, her arms wrapping around him, holding him tight. "It's over," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with exhaustion and relief. "It's finally over." As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky with strokes of pink and gold, they stood on the ledge, the survivors of a long and terrible night. Sheriff Wallace, his arm in a makeshift sling, would take Pastor Chester back to town to face the consequences of his actions. Justice, in its messy and imperfect way, would finally come to Redemption Falls. "Do we still go?" Sarah asked quietly, her hand in Matt's. "To St. Louis?" Matt looked at her, at the woman who had faced down her tormentors, who had fought beside him, who had shown him that a future was still possible. He thought of the life inside her, a new beginning waiting to happen. "I was thinking," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "maybe we don't need to run so far. I hear there's a town a few days east of here, a place called Helena Falls. They're looking for a school teacher." He squeezed her hand. "And they probably wouldn't mind having a man who can play the piano for their church services." Tears of joy welled in Sarah's eyes. "And a man who knows his way around a Bible?" "Maybe," he said, his voice soft. "Someday." He drew her close, the promise of a new life shining brighter than the morning sun. The ghosts of Pine Ridge would always be with him, but they no longer walked alone. He had found a new reason to live, not for vengeance, but for the future they would build together, from the ashes of the past. If you were moved by this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what dark corners of the past we'll explore next.